Hello everyone, this is Akshay over here and welcome to the second part of breathing and exchange of gases from human physiology. So let's get started. So exchange of gases. So the main part of the lung which is mainly involved in exchange of gases is the alveoli, and the process that is mainly involved in exchange of gases is simple diffusion. And the factors that are mainly affecting the rate of diffusion of gases are mainly two reasons. The first being the solubility of the gases, and also the thickness of membranes that are mainly involved in the diffusion, right? We also consider one more factor here is the differences in the partial pressure of the respiratory gases. So what is partial pressure? Partial pressure is the pressure that is exerted by individual gases. So when we look into the respiratory gas, that is the oxygen and carbon dioxide, its partial pressure in the oxygen's partial pressure in the atmospheric air is 159 mmHg, but however, the carbon dioxide's partial pressure in the atmospheric air is around 0.3 mmHg, right? So as soon as the air is actually taken into the lungs and enters into the alveoli, the partial pressure of the oxygen in the alveoli is around 104 mmHg, and the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide is around 40 mmHg. So the deoxygenated blood, which is pumped from the heart to the lungs for the purification purpose, that is for the oxygenation purpose, is actually having a less amount of oxygen and more amount of carbon dioxide. That is, the solubility of gas and also the concentration of the gas is very much less in the deoxygenated blood, right? Hence, what happens here is that at the moment this impure blood or the deoxygenated blood enters to the lungs for purification purpose, the carbon dioxide is actually released into the alveoli and the oxygen is taken up or taken into the blood, right? And this blood again is brought back to the heart, and from the heart, this blood, which is now oxygenated, is pumped to the different part of the body tissues. So now this blood, that is the oxygenated blood, which is present in the systemic arteries, is having a partial pressure of 95 mmHg for oxygen, and the partial pressure for the carbon dioxide is around 40 mmHg. You can also notice that this oxygen, which is high in the oxygenated blood, is delivered into the body tissues because the concentration of the oxygen in the body tissues is very much less. But however, because of metabolic activities, the carbon dioxide concentration is more, and it is readily given into the blood or released into the blood because of lesser partial pressure or lesser concentration of carbon dioxide in the oxygenated blood. So as the oxygen is delivered and the carbon dioxide is taken up, now this blood is termed as the deoxygenated blood, whose partial pressure for oxygen is around 40 mmHg and carbon dioxide is 45 mmHg. And the veins which carries these deoxygenated blood is the systemic veins, which is again brought back to the heart, and from heart it is pumped back to the lungs for the purification purpose, and this cycle goes on. So you can see that because of difference in the concentration of the respiratory gases in body tissues and the alveoli, there is exchange of gases. So the next one we are having is the thickness of the membrane that is also involved in the diffusion. So what we are specifically speaking of here is the alveolar wall and the endothelium of the blood vessels, and finally in between these two, that is the alveolar wall and the endothelium of the blood vessel, there's also one more membrane in between this called as the basement membrane. When you consider all these three membranes, the thickness is even less than 1 or 1 millimeter. So remember, more the surface area of the alveoli, higher the rate of exchange of gases. So if there are any respiratory disorders that affects the respiratory surface of the alveoli, obviously reduced respiratory surface or alveolar surface will result in reduced rate of exchange of gases. So now we can move on to the next part, that is the transport of gases. How the respiratory gases are actually transported in the blood. You can see that around 97% of the oxygen is carried by RBC, and around 3% is dissolved in the plasma, and 20 to 25% of the carbon dioxide is carried by the RBC, and around 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as the bicarbonate ion, which is the major way of transporting the carbon dioxide. and finally around 7% of the CO2 is transported also in the dissolved state in plasma. So now when we look into the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin, there are some again factors that mainly control or regulate the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. And also you can get the graph, okay, and this graph is called as the oxygen dissociation curve. The graph what you're looking over here is called as the oxygen dissociation curve, and you can get the oxygen dissociation curve graph by plotting the percentage of saturation of hemoglobin with the oxygen on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you can see the partial pressure of the oxygen, right? So what are the factors that are mainly involved in binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin? So the first one is the partial pressure of the oxygen. So remember, higher the partial pressure of oxygen, more readily binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. Next one is the hydrogen ion concentration. So lesser the hydrogen ion concentration, more readily binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. So next one is the temperature. Lesser the temperature, more readily binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin, right? So now what happens if the partial pressure of oxygen is less? What happens if the hydrogen ion concentration is more? So what do we mean by hydrogen ion concentration being more? We are referring to the acidity, okay? What if the environment is more acidic in nature, okay? And finally, what happens if the temperature is also slightly more, right? So when the hydrogen ion concentration is more, when the temperature is also more, and when the partial pressure of the oxygen is slightly less, oxygen is given up more easily, right? So the release of oxygen is more promoted. The release of oxygen is more promoted in the higher hydrogen ion concentration, slightly higher temperature, and a lesser partial pressure of the oxygen environment. So what happens to this curve when the hydrogen ion concentration is more, temperature is more, and partial pressure of oxygen is less? This curve shifts slightly to the right side. So this right shifting indicates more readily releasing of oxygen. Okay. So now what happens if the hydrogen ion concentration is less, temperature is again slightly less, and more the partial pressure of the oxygen? So this curve, what happens to this particular curve under these conditions? You can see that the curve will now move towards the more left side. So what does this mean? What does the moving of curve towards the more left side mean? It means that oxygen is binding more strongly with the hemoglobin. This is the condition only when the hydrogen concentration is less, temperature is also less, and a more partial pressure of oxygen is observed, and also strong binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin is there. But what about this curve? As we have already discussed, this curve mainly indicates release of oxygen more easily, dissociation of oxygen from the hemoglobin, right? So this binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin is termed as oxyhemoglobin. So now for around 100 ml of oxygenated blood, around 5 ml of oxygen is delivered into the tissues. So moving on, what about the transport of carbon dioxide? So we have already discussed that the carbon dioxide is transported again in three ways. Around 7% of the carbon dioxide is transported in the plasma in the dissolved state, and around 20 to 25% of the carbon dioxide is also transported in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. What is carbaminohemoglobin? It is the carbon dioxide which is bound or attached to the hemoglobin is called as carbaminohemoglobin. So what is the factor that affects the formation or promotes the formation of carbaminohemoglobin? Remember, it is the high PCO2 that favors the formation of carbaminohemoglobin. So where do you find a high PCO2? Only in the tissues, right? So as the PCO2 or the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide is more in the tissues, you can see that there is a more easy formation of carbaminohemoglobin. But whereas in the alveoli, the PCO2 or the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide is very much less. As a result, the carbon dioxide is released easily in the alveoli, right? So we also discussed in the last slide that around 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported in the form of bicarbonate ion, right? And this bicarbonate ion formation is mainly because of one particular enzyme called as the carbonic anhydrase, right? So the carbon dioxide inside the RBC combines with the water and it is mainly forming the carbonic acid, right? So this carbonic acid readily dissociates into bicarbonate ion and H plus ions. So now here you also see one more phenomenon called as the chloride shift. So what is chloride shift? So let us look into the same reaction what we have done over here in the diagram. The carbon dioxide which is produced in the tissue is crossing the endothelium. This is the endothelium and reaches into the is taken up by the RBC. Inside the RBC, the Ca means carbonic anhydrase. So inside the RBC, the carbon dioxide is converted into bicarbonate ion. So this bicarbonate ion from the RBC goes into the plasma, and simultaneously one chlorine ion enters into the RBC. So this exchange of one chlorine for one bicarbonate ion is called as the chloride shift. So now when the deoxygenated blood reaches to the alveoli, you can see that the chlorine molecule comes out of the RBC and the bicarbonate ion enters back into the RBC, and this bicarbonate ion is again converted back into CO2, which is released into the alveoli, and from the alveoli the CO2 is exhaled out, right? So it is basically, you can see that it is the reverse reaction that has what we have seen here. So around for every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood, around 4 ml of carbon dioxide is released. So now let us look into the regulation of respiration. How respiration is actually regulated. The respiratory rhythm is actually maintained by one particular center called as the respiratory rhythm center, which is present in the middle of the brain. Also, you find one more region called as the pneumotaxic area, which is present in the pons of the brain, which actually moderates the functions of respiratory rhythm. So we can see that pneumotaxic area mainly controls the functions of respiratory rhythm center. And you also find another part called as the chemosensitive area, which is present adjacent to the rhythm center, respiratory rhythm center, and it is mainly sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. So you can see that when there is increase in the hydrogen ions and the CO2 concentration, it actually activates the chemosensitive area, and chemosensitive area makes the necessary respiratory adjustments and elimination of hydrogen ions and also carbon dioxide. So you also see that there are some chemoreceptors which are present in the aortic arch and also carotid arteries. Remember, carotid arteries are the ones that supply the blood to the brain, oxygenated blood to the brain. So the receptors which are present in the aortic arch and also the carotid arteries can also detect the hydrogen ion concentration and also the CO2 concentration. So what happens next is that there's a signal that is sent to the respiratory rhythm, and also necessary respiratory adjustments are actually done. So in this way, the respiration is regulated. So finally of this chapter, we will discuss about the disorders of the respiratory system. So the first one we are having is the asthma. So the asthma is mainly because of inflammation of bronchi and the bronchioles. So what is the symptom? You can see that there is difficulty in breathing and causes wheezing. The next one we are having is the emphysema, and one of the major reason for the emphysema is the cigarette smoking. So what happens in the case of emphysema is that the alveolar wall is mainly damaged and it reduces the respiratory surface. So as a result, the rate of exchange of respiratory gases is reduced because of damage in the alveolar wall. And finally, we are having is the occupational respiratory disorders. So what happens is that there is a development of a fibrosis, and especially the fibrosis is observed in the case of people who are mainly involved in stone breaking industry and also grinding industry. So this completes this particular chapter, and I'm extremely sorry that there was some delay with the this video. I was stuck with some of my work. So anyway, I will try to keep up with my schedule as soon as possible. So if you found this particular video very much helpful, then please like it and share it among your friends, and also do subscribe to this particular channel, and also leave your opinion and any improvements if there are required in the video in the comment section. Thank you.